The European Green Deal is basically, it's a strategy document. It's, if you will, it's a construct, it's a political story that EU leaders have agreed upon that contains a lot of political intention. And so its strength, its power lies in providing a sense of a common direction. And if I could have the next slide, please. The word I think that you could work with is, in part, it's an umbrella. It covers a lot of different initiatives, but it it gives you a common architecture. You are all like under that same roof, under that umbrella, under which a lot of different initiatives are being brought together. And the new dimension here really is, compared to previous strategies, and especially previous strategies with a green dimension, environmental strategies, this is now an all-economy strategy that has environmental concerns and goals as a guiding theme. But, make no mistake, this is the European Union. This is now an EU strategy, the long-term guiding EU strategy, which means it's an economic strategy. It's still a growth strategy. The person that is kind of the driving force and the original proponent of the European Green Deal, the current Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, she's a member of the Conservative Party in Germany. She's not a Green Party member. This is still, even if she's in the progressive spectrum, this is still a growth and economic strategy. Next slide, please. A couple of things that are under that umbrella, so that you have a sense of that. And this is one of the official EU Commission graphs, so I take no responsibility for it, and I want to acknowledge the source. It's climate policy, clean energy, circular economy, resource efficiency, zero pollution, biodiversity, a healthy food and environmentally friendly food system, etc. A lot of these initiatives and sub-objectives, if you will, and they're all covered by the umbrella of the European Green Deal. So you get the sense that they're not only are they addressing different types of environmental issues, but they are also addressing different policy areas. And this is basically, I think, a visual from at the very start of when the European Green Deal was adopted. And so I have today, in the course of today, I've added a few specifics in terms of the initiatives that actually were published by the Commission that try to pursue these objectives. So if you give me the next slide, you'll see a slightly messier version of the same graph. Sorry about that. You will get the slides after. But to give you a sense of actually what's happening under the European Green Deal. So what the Commission has been doing as the body in the EU that proposes legislation upon mandate by political leaders from the member states and the European Parliament. It publishes legislation and also strategies in sense, they're preparatory documents to actual legislation. And you can see here that, like on almost all of these other fields, there are specific documents, there are other initiatives that have actually been published in the meantime. So in the now, what is it? It's 2+ a bit years since the European Green Deal was presented. Quite a bit has been moved and all fits under that umbrella. Not all of that was necessarily new. Some of it is repackaged, as in there were political processes that were already undergoing, but it now all fits under that umbrella. Next slide, please. The key thing, of course, for our theme today is climate neutrality, and the fact that becoming climate neutral by 2050 is the key guiding theme for the European Green Deal. And that goal was put in there, but doesn't originate actually from the European Green Deal, but came out of a process from the previous Commission, which published a document that we know as a long-term strategy in climate governance terms by it was published at the end of November 2018, I think, so a little over 4 years ago, and a year before the European Green Deal. And if I could have the next slide, please. You know, this is, if you take away the fancy graphics that the Commission gets comms agencies to do, you know, this is what it actually looks in terms of text on paper. I think one of the starting paragraphs of that document from the Commission, but it does something remarkable when it comes to EU policy because it uses the word vision. This document was really laying out a vision of a Europe that can achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 through a socially fair transition in a cost-efficient manner. Now, all kinds of boxes ticked. The economic concerns box, the social concern box ticked, and this is now the green transition as kind of the leading theme. And this presentation at the end of 2018 may not have made it into the Green Deal and into EU law, if not for, next slide, please. The fact, oh, see, this is where I'm confused with my own sequence of things. Anyway, so what is, my apologies for that. What does climate neutrality mean? This is a graph from that document, which is telling in several respects. On the one hand, it shows you the scale of the challenge. What does it mean to become climate neutral? It means that emissions in all sectors of the economy need to go down. You see that from the curve going all the way down to 2050. What is a little harder to see from this graph at a first glance is that also getting to climate neutrality doesn't mean that there is necessarily just one path. There's not one climate neutral future. There can be several possible futures that all get you to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. You can try to overall consume less, be more circular in your economic activities, and reduce emissions that way. And then also you will, by 2050, have fewer remaining emissions and need less to compensate in terms of carbon removals, especially the use of forestry and uptake of carbon in soils, etc., to create such sinks. But there are other ways of doing it. You can also use technical means of soaking up carbon, and then maybe using overall more energy. You still have remaining emissions in industry, etc. So there are different ways of getting there, and that's a general principle that needs to be understood when we talk about climate neutrality, and that was already also acknowledged and included in this Commission document. Now, next slide, please. I already mentioned our current President of the European Commission, who was the proponent of the European Green Deal, and she, in her speech to make the case for why she should become a European Commission President before the European Parliament, she spelled out as a key goal that she wanted Europe to become the first continent that will become climate neutral. And she said, I'm going to put all of that in a Green Deal for Europe, and I will also make it legally binding. And this was in the middle of 2019. And next slide, please. 2019 is also the year in which it was possible, I think, to actually get such an ambitious long-term objective agreed and have it be politically palatable and feasible, because we had mass protests in the streets across most of Europe and other parts of the world as well. And so it's on the back of the perceived pressure that politicians felt that it was possible to get backing for an agenda that basically now mainstreams, means integrating across everything under that big umbrella, the goal of climate neutrality for all of EU policy. Next slide, please. So this was actually indeed the proposal for this goal was adopted by the European Council at the end of that year in 2019. And now I want to talk, next slide, please, about the specific piece that was also referenced in the introduction, the European Climate Law. which, as far as also my own area of work is concerned, is the most specific concrete piece that's come out of under the European Green Deal that puts all of this also in a legally binding form. Now, what does the EU climate law do? First of all, it's important to know that it takes, it basically creates a framework. What does that mean? It means it creates a legal framework. It puts together, basically contains the rules for how climate policy is organized. That is what governance frameworks do. So they assign responsibility, who has to do what, by when, and they do so across a certain range of functions that I will speak about in a minute. But I want to acknowledge first that this adoption of and the proposal for such a law at the EU level was inspired by things that happened in the member states. Because a number of EU countries had already gone ahead and established legally binding frameworks for their climate policy making. And if I can have the next slide, then you'll see a map that shows you that, in fact, 16 out of 27 EU member states, as per the end of last year, had some form of such a climate framework law that basically organizes how climate policy is being done and who contributes to it. So a vast majority of EU member states have climate laws. And if you get to the next slide, you'll see that there are even more where there is a concrete process considering a draft or revising a law. And so you see member states were basically got there first almost, or are now following. And this was the inspiration for what was adopted at the EU level. Next slide. So a couple of key points on what is usually included in such frameworks. They basically try to answer a couple of key questions. And one of them is, what is it we want to achieve? So it's talking about targets. Then the next question that they try to answer is, how are you organizing your way towards achieving that target? Which means planning in terms of, what are my possibilities of getting there? Remember that graph with the pathway earlier, the emissions pathway. And what are my policies that will trigger the change that needs to happen? And then the next question is, okay, not the next slide, thank you, my apologies, is how well are we doing in terms of achieving those targets? And that requires getting information about your progress to be able to measure whether you're on track. And when you have that information, you can then check, okay, am I doing enough? Or is there something missing? Are my policies the correct ones? Do I need new ones? And then you're going into a revision of your measures and your actions so that you can check whether you can do better in terms of achieving your targets. And a couple of other things that this is basically what we call a policy cycle. And this is basically what climate framework laws try to organize. And they also often provide opportunities for additional inputs to this process. So what we have here is, you see on the right-hand side in the bottom, a couple of bodies there that are meant to be scientific advisors. That's commonly found in such frameworks, and also opportunities, of course, for public consultation and input. And if in terms of moving on and getting towards kind of the end of my presentation, I want to show you what specifically is in the EU climate law in the next slide. We have almost all of those elements are addressed in some form or another in the EU climate law. We have targets in there for 2030, so for the near term, but also this objective of climate neutrality by 2050 is written into the law as legally binding for the EU as a whole. And there is a process to set a goal for the time in between for 2040. There's also something on the planning element, although that's largely covered already in other legislation in the EU. And there's also something in there on the policies. But that dimension, the kind of how do we get there part was largely already covered in other laws. But crucially, there is a new mechanism for the progress monitoring. So specifically, the European Commission has to do an assessment of whether the EU is on track towards climate neutrality. So not only does it put the goal in there as legally binding, but also a process to make sure that we know whether we're meeting it. And another innovation is what I have here under the review function. There are several new mechanisms in the law that provide for the opportunity to check whether our existing EU policy is actually in line with that goal. And we don't know yet how well this will work, what the Commission will be able to do with it, but it's essentially a big opportunity to also weed out some of the policies that contribute to emissions going forward. And last but not least, there is in fact also a scientific advisory body that was created under this EU climate law that we didn't have in this form at the EU level before, but it was also an inspiration by what's happening at the member state level. And so as of about a year ago now, I think, a new scientific advisory board on climate change was founded at the EU level that is meant to be very independent and provide input to EU policymaking. So these are some of the examples of what's in the EU climate law. And then I have two more pieces, but I want to check whether I can still add them because I feel like I've gone on for potentially longer than you wanted me to already.
It would be lovely if you could wrap up within a minute.
Okay, that is ambitious, but I shall aim to do so. So I'll give you a peek of what will otherwise be in my slides. If I could have the next slide, and then the next after that, and the next after that. Thank you. It's basically a check at whether we are on track that I could speak more to if you wanted me to. Actually, I need 2 more slides down. Not that I was going to show all of this, but if we're talking about implementation and progress and where are the challenges in EU climate policy right now, then one key thing to do is to look at the sectors. And you do see that I was using the drawing function here in PowerPoint, which I cannot recommend, as you can tell. But I think the big messages here is like our emissions actually have been going down in the EU, not as fast enough for our new sets of targets maybe, but they have been going down significantly. But you can see where that's happened, essentially in power production, in energy supply, and to some extent in industry. But in agriculture, emissions are basically staying the same. In buildings, they have gone down just a little bit, and in transport, partly. So we have made big progress already when you look at emissions overall. But if you're looking at a more, with a more differentiated perspective, then you see that there are specific sectors that have not made progress at all. And so if we're looking at implementation, that's a big problem. And I'll finish with my last slide, which is indeed that I'm hoping that we can talk more about also, the public pressure and activism can support, as it did already a few years ago, as I showed earlier for 2019, and for the coming into existence of the Green Deal, how such public outcry can support also the implementation of our goal of climate neutrality. Thank you.